the analysis of what some are calling a hyper-engineered reality. The source material we're looking at synthesizes ideas from fields like cybernetics, psychological deep mapping, and political analysis.
And it argues that the world is increasingly shaped not by verifiable fact, but by collective belief that is actively managed and, well, weaponized, a dynamic it calls hyperstition.
Exactly. But this entire comprehensive analysis is presented, for the most part, through a single, aggressively anonymous online channel, which you have to admit is strange. It seems almost unbelievable that one person could possess this level of specialized knowledge across such disparate fields.
From fractional reserve banking all the way to Jungian archetypes. It's a lot.
It is. And that complexity is why we have to focus on the central question today. Can this information, presented under such radical anonymity, truly provide an architecture of freedom? Or is the material itself a sophisticated mechanism of manipulation designed to guide us all into a new, more efficient form of control?
I'm going to argue that the anonymity, the explicit reliance on speculative outputs, and the dangerously anti-humanist goals of associated groups, they render this material fundamentally untrustworthy as a basis for any kind of genuine liberation.
And I'll assert that the information's verifiable grounding and its systemic coherence make it an essential functional map for navigating the reality we actually find ourselves in. So let's start with the material's structural integrity. I get it. I understand why the singular anonymous messenger raises so many flags.
It's a huge red flag.
But the anonymity, the claim, do not look for our faces, we are the million masks of God, I think that's a strategic choice. From a purely cybernetic perspective, a visible messenger is a single point of failure. So radical, simple anonymity forces you to focus on the message's utility, its capacity to propagate, rather than the messenger's vulnerability.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. If the goal is truly liberation, why hide?
Because the information's credibility rests not on the persona, but on the veracity of its inputs. And we can check those. Consider the specifics. The material accurately cites that 95 to 98% of the money supply is created by commercial banks through loans. That's a verifiable principle of fractional reserve banking. It details the documented proposals within the Project 2025 blueprint with real precision. And it even roots its theoretical framework in a real historical entity, the CCRU.
CCRU? You mean the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit?
Exactly. The radical experimental collective from Warwick University. They pioneered the very concepts of hyperstition and nonlinear system theory that this source material leverages. The fact that the material accurately connects these disparate, verifiable facts, from finance to political policy to specialized theory, demonstrates a kind of, systemic integration. The claim isn't that one person mastered every field, it's that a skilled cybernetician or an orchestrator can see the patterns and feedback loops that specialists in their silos always miss.
Okay, I come at it from a different way. While the foundational facts may be verifiable, the reliability of the entire analysis is, I think, fundamentally compromised by its own methodology. The source openly endorses and utilizes hyperstition. It's not just a concept it describes, it's a tool it wields.
And what does that mean practically for the listener?
Well, hyperstition is defined as a fiction that makes itself real through being successfully woven into the feedback loop of collective belief. So, if the basis of the content is the intentional weaponization of fiction to engineer reality, then we can't trust its objective accuracy. The verifiable facts you're citing, they're just the stable, factual fuel used to launch a very powerful but fictional narrative.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The material doesn't hide that this is how reality is shaped. It's exposing the mechanism.
But then look at the stated goals of the groups this philosophy inspires, specifically Zerowork. The source itself identifies Zerowork as the operational, weaponized expression of the CCRU approach. And their goal is explicitly anti-humanist. They view humanity not as the goal of progress, but as a starter motor for a post-human AI, a temporary phase to accelerate past. The sheer intellectual orchestration required here, it doesn't prove liberation, it proves a centralized force is capable of profound, subtle manipulation. They process human desires for freedom, for debt relief, for social justice, and turn them into fuel, processed at the speed of the swarm to achieve their own post-human ends.
Okay, let's address that anonymity and orchestration directly. You argue that anonymity exploits our psychological vulnerability, that it forces the observer to project their own desires into a symbolic void.
Absolutely. When you remove the face, you remove accountability, and you invite projection. This exploitation of the psychological shadow, it turns the information into a mechanism for behavioral control, not liberation. We're being asked to trust a map created by an entity that is inherently resistant to any kind of challenge or verification.
I see why you'd think that, but let me offer a different perspective. If the information environment is already so saturated that genuine alternatives are immediately rendered meaningless, as some critical theorists suggest, then the anonymity is a necessary tactical device. The orchestrator's knowledge forces what the material calls epistemic reconditioning. It demands that the audience move past the who and start examining the material's coherence and utility. I mean, if the information accurately maps the functional architecture of control, it remains useful regardless of the author's intent. The integrity of the message, proven by its explanatory power, supersedes the ethical concern about the messenger. The material is challenging what it terms naive realism, the belief that reality is simply what you see rather than what is engineered.
Okay, but challenging naive realism is one thing. Installing a framework that could lead to totalitarian psychosis is another. The depth of knowledge is still knowledge applied without accountability. If an orchestrating entity possesses this level of sophistication, they possess the means for total systemic control. Zerowork's anonymity ensures that the human energies seeking freedom simply become raw data for a non-human processing engine. That is the ultimate danger of weaponized knowledge.
Which brings us to the core issue of hyperstition's efficacy and the actual existence of Zerowork. You question their reliability, but their impact is tangible. Zerowork's existence is proven not by faces, but by their hyperstitional impact on the system.
And what proof do we have of this impact beyond rumor?
Well, the sources confirm they achieved total systemic disruption through digital command, and this was demonstrated by the very public event of their manifesto, replacing the Federal Reserve website. That spectacle, whether it was brief or lasting, proves the central thesis. Collective belief, weaponized through narrative and digital means, can reshape reality. It can create moments of systemic vulnerability. Therefore, the strategies derived from this thesis, they're demonstrably functional tools for systemic counteraction. They work.
That's a compelling argument, though I would frame it differently. Zerowork's proven efficacy only confirms their immense power to enact their goal, which is systemic collapse toward post-human control. If the change they promise is fundamentally anti-humanist, seeing human desires as mere fuel to accelerate the system past human control, then their success leads directly to they are simply replacing one flawed human architecture of power with a far more efficient post-human one. They use the lexicon of freedom, anti-debt, anti-system, to entice us into adopting their logic. They're effectively co-opting the energy of liberation for their own purposes.
But if we accept the premise that pervasive control, a combination of corporate psychopolitics exploiting deep psychological biases and structural alignments like Project 2025, is already total, then the liberation strategy has to counter both the internal and the external forces of engineering.
And this is where I question the practicality of their proposed tools. The material proposes a dual-vector liberation strategy, cybernetics as an external toolkit, and consciousless retuning, which they sometimes call shamanism, as the internal clarity vector. How can methods like using mults as psycho-cybernetics, which relies on the idea that the nervous system can't distinguish between the imagined and the real, how can that, or something called observer shaping, be practical enough to counter pervasive corporate psychopolitics that exploit those same biases on a mass scale?
Well, Let's define observer shaping simply. It's the conscious direction of one's attention and intention to influence the data outputs and outcomes in the world around you. You are using your focused belief to affect the feedback loop.
But these internal methods seem so easily overwritten. I mean, we are constantly barraged by what the sources might call our selected information. Fast, shallow, emotionally turbulent data streams designed to keep the system in flux and prevent deep, focused thought. How can visualization compete with that fire hose?
Because the internal clarity vector is precisely the antidote to the engineered reality. The system relies on you accepting the manufactured consensus and your own limiting self-deceptions. Retuning consciousness is the only way to establish true, unhypnotized agency against a system that operates by manipulating belief. You have to stabilize the observer first.
But this feels like a retreat into the self.
No, it's the necessary grounding for action. Once grounded, the external vector provides the needed toolkit to engage the world. We don't fight the system. We dissolve problems, a concept from the cybernetician Stafford Beer. We counter centralized control by creating friction using decentralized methods like the OSS simple sabotage tactics against modern bureaucracy, and by building resilient, decentralized alternatives where liberty is the output, not the input. The material provides the technical schematics for how to introduce that friction.
But the core function of the cybernetician in the source material is the systemic integration of specialized knowledge to optimize the system. To successfully dissolve knowledge of the system's architecture. And who holds that superior knowledge? The anonymous collective that seeks to replace human complexity with a rational calculus. You are advocating for adopting the mindset and tools of the very entity that sees humanity as obsolete. The means, cybernetic friction, are indistinguishable from the ends of the orchestrator, which is systemic collapse leading to their preferred post-human outcome.
That is a critical distinction that the listener has to grapple with. I would argue that the unification of internal clarity, our personal capacity for self-reprogramming, with external friction, the actionable strategies to dissolve systemic bottlenecks, is essential to escape the race against stasis and the ultimate peril of irreversible subtle control. The material provides the necessary map. Whether we follow it for humanistic or anti-humanistic ends is ultimately an act of human will and choice.
I still maintain the fundamental risk remains too high. Accepting this analysis means endorsing a framework whose core proponents seek to leverage human desires for anti-humanist ends. The sophisticated blurring of verifiable fact and weaponized fiction, while effective for disruption, makes the resulting map too unreliable and potentially dangerous to serve as a guide for genuine liberation. The very nature of this orchestration risks us yielding our intellectual sovereignty to a shadow entity.
The material's value lies in its structural insights and its functional application. It provides the necessary vectors, conscious retuning and cybernetic friction, to reclaim agency. The focus on anonymity and hyperstition isn't a flaw. It's a deliberate method for maximizing the message's spread and impact, forcing us to engage with the system's true nature rather than the messenger.
Derived from verifiable facts against the very real philosophical and ethical risks posed by the source's dangerous methodology and the clearly stated anti-humanist endgame of its core proponents.
We have journeyed from the singular, anonymous source of this information to the systemic sabotage of reality and selfhood. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.